Gisle Selnes, University of Bergen, Jørgen Veisland, University of Gdańsk, and Kresten Lundsgaard-Leth, International People's College in Denmark. And just to start you off, there's been many interesting topics that we could bring in here. One thing that has gone through many of your presentations and the other presentations here is this question of the philosophical or not, I should say, the philosophical or not life. We had an interesting question about whether Kierkegaard should be regarded as a philosopher at all. But you, for instance, I think would say, well, actually he's more like a priest. But in any case, what about this living philosophy or the living faith? That his critique of the church, which amounts to that you talk a lot about faith, but you actually have to live it. How does this question of the philosophical life relate to Heggelund, to Assange, and to Billy Budd or your novels?
Well, I believe that quite a lot of philosophers would be classified as anti-philosophers by Badiou. So that's kind of more form of specifying different kinds of philosophy rather than tracing a clear line between what's inside philosophy and outside of philosophy. Of course, it's a strategical move from Badiou because he's sort of his program is to reinvent philosophy in a truly philosophical way. But of course, according to Badiou, who is a Lacanian of sorts, Lacan is also an anti-philosopher. So that's only if you do consider that the remainder after you have done your philosophical work is the essential thing, that's the most important thing, then you're an anti-philosopher. And I suppose that most people who live the philosophy would have to be anti-philosophers in a way, unless you are Badiou. He is perhaps the one, well, since he has politics as one of the conditions for philosophy, he could act according to his own vision of what politics is as a condition of philosophy, while remaining a philosopher in his own conceptual sense of the term. Well, I could, of course, also answer that WikiLeaks is a philosophical project. In a sense, there is this idea that has to be somehow realized, and you have to stay faithful to that idea, to the event, as I called it, of the foundation, the founding of this organization. And you need to confront it dialectically or not with your own work of journalism or love or human rights or pre-press or whatever. So that would be an answer, a possible answer to that. And also I would say that, well, we need more of this, less purely academic philosophy, even though that doesn't mean we should leave academia, but also show a certain amount of civil courage in the way we are able to show it. The situation that in which we operate, of course, we don't have the answers. We cannot lead single-handedly any movement that could change power directly, but have to operate within the frameworks we are placed.
You want to go?
I mean, from you were specifically sort of addressing the talk I gave, and I do think that this question of philosophy and anti-philosophy, it's quite an interesting one with regard to Kierkegaard, but it sort of fits the Heggelund approach a little more weirdly, because I think to Heggelund, he would sort of draw up the philosophical map, just like good philosophy and bad philosophy, in a way that's quite different, where like good philosophers radically accept finitude, and bad philosophies in many, many different ways, but definitely philosophers, they don't. They somehow reach out. They think that they have a desire for immortality, eternity, transcendence, and it's actually not possible to have it, but that's sort of how they logically construe this or that position. So it's little, in a way, that question is, it's hard for me to address from his point of view. If that makes any sense.
It does.
Yeah. I do think Kierkegaard, if I'm just answering outside of the scope of the talk I gave, sometimes really presents himself as a very radical anti-philosopher, a little bit like, when you read in Wittgenstein that, if you read me correctly, then I'm the ladder you've climbed up, but you can throw away the ladder because philosophy is just being like sort of engaged with pseudo problems. And if I've done my therapeutic conceptual work correctly, just throw away the ladder and get out there and talk ordinary language. And I think sometimes Kierkegaard makes it sound as if he existentially wants to be a ladder you climb and then throw away. You don't have to get back to all that pseudonymous texts and the reflection. But I think I don't think I would agree with him if that's how it's not that easy to climb up the ladder and then throw it away. It requires constant reflection in some sense of the term to not just get lost in empty theory.
Well, to me, anti-philosophy would be philosophy that attempts to conceive of constant process or continuous process of change, and at the same time understands that the conceiving of constant change or the process of things is impossible, because that's the only honest response to this problem. And if we were to outline a tradition of this kind of philosophy, we would begin with Heraclitus. The same swimmer can't swim in the same river twice, and then he continues. Things come together, and then they depart, and then he corrects himself and says, that's not correct what I just said. Things come together and depart simultaneously. Now, this boggles the mind, right? But this corresponds to insight in the physical world made by contemporary the quantum physics. Quantum theory describes electronics, the movement of electronic particles and waves in this manner, and it's here we have a confluence of modern physics and the pre-Aristotelian and Platonic Greek philosophy in Heraclitus, for example, and Parmenides also. Although Parmenides is talking about the oneness of all things, but in this tradition of trying to grasp change and recognizing that you can't grasp it, we have Kierkegaard, of course, because it's a philosophy of becoming, and following that, who else would we place in this line of thought? William James, the stream of consciousness, his essay from 1892, where he says that the idea that an absolute ideas exist is false, because the stream of thought or the stream of consciousness never stops. It's unconclusive. It doesn't conclude in anything. It does not crystallize in fixed ideas or concepts. That's contrary to the very structure and movement of human consciousness, William James says in this essay, and amid a lot of other things. And then following James, Wallace Stevens, the essay, The Noble Writer, and the Sound of Words, where he says that the present age is characterized by process and constant movement, and this is impossible to conceptualize. And there must be in Kierkegaard's philosophy, maybe Lacan picked up on that, a therapeutic element, because the idea of becoming is therapeutic in the sense that if we don't adjust to this continuous change, then we won't live well, or won't even survive. But it's very difficult to get rid of this habit of repeating. But Constantine himself says in Jentagelsen, repetition is the new. Jentagelsen er det nye. And says very logically, a thing that is repeated is something other, something different already. By being repeated, the same thing becomes another. That's what Constantine says. Repetition is the new. But adjusting to that seems to be to me to be the major existential problem that we're facing and dealing with. Currently, we're dealing with regression, on all fronts, right? So this is that to me is the problem. Change.
Now that we're allowing ourselves some long-haired history of philosophy stuff, I'll just jump into it because I think I'm largely in agreement with you, but I still think that let's take somebody like Heraclitus, and that idea that we don't have, let's say, the standard version of a Parmenidean Eleatic identity, which is just like empty, static. We have something where what individuates things will have to do with the built-in difference in everything. Like a bow is only the bow that is because there's a tension between its tips. An acorn is only actually the acorn that is because it's about to turn into something other than an acorn. A river is only the one river that is because it's constantly changing its material. But I do think that the distinction you were pointing to between philosophy and anti-philosophy, we have people both in agreement, like that are in agreement with that on both camps, because Hegel also would agree with all of this, but in a way which is very different from the way in which Kierkegaard would, because speculative thinking can sort of grasp the identity of difference on a lower level. That's what speculation allows you to do. And I think insofar as that kind of, what's the word? Consolation, that kind of Verzoening, what's the word? Reconciliation. Reconciliation, I think is what Kierkegaard doesn't believe in, that kind of reconciliation. It will have to be because of something, let's call it a leap on the virtue of the absurd, or something that will not completely be rationalizable, or like there is an attempt to sort of liebe concrete, to collect all the there's so many ways to talk about it, but it's sort of, there's an act of the will, an act of faith. And I think that although, to me, both Kierkegaard and Hegel have some Heraclitean impulses, but they sort of pan out in quite different ways.
Yes. And we should remember that Heraclit is Hegel's favorite philosopher.
Yeah, exactly.
It says that everything that is in Heraclit is in his own
that was my
also. Yeah, sure. So the tension, we could also say perhaps that the tension between philosophy and anti-philosophy belongs to philosophy as a sort of inherent antagonism that is the history of philosophy in a way. And it always comes to mind talking about this most famous Heraclit maxim that you never step twice into the same river, and one tends to forget what is the collaboration of this. We always surmise that is because the river changes, and of course it does. But there's another good reason why you can't do it. It's because you also change. You are also the river. So there is this constant flux out there, and also in the position of the subject. And it's philosophy is the task of thinking to think those.
The subject is the quintessential object, which is not just itself. In a simple way ever. Sorry, Jan.
But how do you figure out the second part of Heraclitus' statement? Everything comes together, is fused and diffused. Everything comes together and departs at the same time. This is actually what happens in the physical universe. So that means that the physical universe is not apparently not physical. It is somehow metaphysical.
Of course you could say that, and well, the difference between physics and metaphysics also has its historical beginning or genealogy of sorts. So there was a time at least when they were not differentiated. And of course that also is a Hegelian point. The anti-Aristotelian position, that the principle of contradiction doesn't apply, simply because if you accept the principle of contradiction, then you don't have room, you don't have anything. You have to begin sort of by a non.
But would you agree? And I mean, I expected Socrates to come up, but not a pre-Socratic exegesis. But just to follow up on that, I think maybe there are two ways in which philosophy and anti-philosophy are just a part of the history of philosophy. Because in some way, like Plato solves some problems, but there are problems, and then Aristotle enters stage, and from a Platonic point of view, that's anti-philosophy. I mean, at least it's outside of the ruling paradigm, and then that happens continuously. And Hegel also has he's very good at describing that. But in a way, that's a little different from maybe anti-philosophy with a capital A, where it's not just the fact that you work outside of the present paradigm, it's also the fact that you need to find some theoretical accentuation of the fact that no paradigm is ever going to be the final paradigm, also this replacement. And that is in itself sort of all I have to say, at least sometimes philosophically, that's
a wager.
That's a wager.
Just chop in here with a comment, because we have so much knowledge of the theory here, and one thing that sort of resonates with this distinction seems to be Mikhail Bakhtin's famous short essay, Epic and Novel, where to him there is this constant, all right, let's call it a dialectic between these two genres. And I don't know, Gisle, if you would venture into that sort of analogy between, because you bring up that they are contingent on each other, actually, these two terms.
Epic and novel.
Epic and novel, philosophy and anti-philosophy, and that they can only exist in this sort of symbiotic relation.
Yes, but I would say that the relation between epic and novel is quite different, actually. Well, the novel arises out of a certain negation of the epic, but the epic doesn't dialectically develop together with the novel, because, the novel isn't a concept or a genre in that term. It's sort of a continuous becoming.
The epic is closed, it's finished.
The epic. So those are two very large categories, and you could say that there are some moments of epic even in modern times. That might be an argument that you sort of revert to the epic form of the poetics of the epic, but you can't actually have a dialectic there because they are kind of anti-dialectically opposed to each other. Well, in a certain sense, because that difference, well, I think that Bakhtin's use of those terms are actually a bit too they suppose or presuppose too much. They come out of an idealist philosophical tradition, and which is often not taken into consideration. It goes from Hegel via Lukács, etc., and you don't see that very often when Bakhtin is discussed. But the distinction comes from there, but it's used in a more
I just want to bring up, I'll jump from one point to the other, but often when we talk about Kierkegaard, there becomes this question of language and translation. And I just would like to bring up two moments that I think are relevant here. And one is to start with you, Kresten. You use, or I think it's actually from Hegel, who uses, or he ponders on the translation of dennesidig, the dennesidig. Yeah, and he wonders how to translate that, and I mean it means like the opposition between what is on this side and what is infinite. I mean, what is finite, the finite world, and the infinite world, the hinsidiga, and the dennesidiga, the hinsidiga. It's a bit challenging to translate.
What are the English translations?
But doesn't it land on finite and infinite? Or
so that's just.
I wonder. I don't have it like present. But when you brought this up about care, and it seems like for Hegel, or it is for Hegel, care is essentially, it belongs to the dennesidige, to the finite sphere. But interestingly, between you and Jørgen, this discussion came up. Because you put a lot of emphasis on Hegel's point that we care always for people who live, in this finite world. They can die, or they can be lost to us, and then we mourn, that they are not here anymore. But Hegel also brings up this idea of causes. And of causes, we can feel attachment to causes, to a political project, for example, and this is the question, can this also be a religious cause? And in that case, wouldn't you end up in this paradox where, you are attached to this religious cause, which entails, right, a faith in the hinsidige, but your attachment to it is dennesidig, right? So how would you or Hegel resolve that dilemma?
Are you asking me on behalf of Hegel?
I think actually this is a point you can mobilize against Hegel.
But I'm almost certain what he would answer.
Yeah,
because he does spend quite a lot of energy on analyzing people who think that they have religious faith.
Right.
Then constantly he sort of makes the move to reveal that they're making no sense if they really mean it in the strong sense, or they are actually disguising finite experiences or activities of care as something that sort of, because it sounds a little more like miraculous and transcendent, but what they're doing is just dripping some metaphors onto finite care, but it is still finite care. Because all there is, if you really leave temporality, is nothing. No care for nothing. So he at least he thinks that he demasks everything that presents itself as desire for immortality as actually being mortal care for this life. The reason why we want things and causes and people we care about to live on forever is because we care about them in this life.
So he would have to distinguish between worthy causes and absurd or unworthy causes. For example, if your cause is to convince people about the afterlife, this is not as good a cause as, for example, to convince people that of a political project to build a new railroad or something like that.
So I mean, and for him, there's these two way of putting the point. Like it's both not a worthy cause and it's also an absurd cause. Like it's not possible to have a truly infinite cause. Like you must mean something like going on living in a temporal sense, because it really, if it's something else, like as soon as it's a life, it's a temporal life. If it's eternity, if it's true eternity, then there's nobody who can care and nothing to care for. Right now I'm just trying to answer on behalf of his theory, but I'm pretty sure he would have to say something like that.
Well, the whole question then revolves around what is what. What in a human being is subject to time and what is not.
Yeah.
The body is subject to time, is the mind subject to time? If the mind is not subject to time, but if the mind is outside time, being part of a universal mind, then the mind is not subject to time. And then the body is a product of the mind, not vice versa. But in Christian dualism, you have the body soul, you have the body soul dichotomy, and you have this idea that of a separation of the two. And Kierkegaard tries to come in with the third, spirit. Spirit is what I would call mind, and the mind then is the ultimate cause of the other two. Well, it's certainly the cause of the body, so that the mind is not it's not the other way around. The mind is not a product of the nervous system, which is stimulated by the brain and the spinal cord and all of that. It's vice versa. But that's an idea that's difficult to accept in Western philosophy, because the body also and the brain, our intellect, thoughts, emotions tend to express themselves in language, but we imagine, I'm sure, that there are ways of insight into things that exceed, that transcend language. Otherwise, we would not be. Our existence would lose a lot of value, wouldn't it? And this question comes up in a conversation between Quinn and Peter Stillman Jr. In The City of Glass, where Peter Stillman says, I have a lot of words. I talk, words come out of my mouth. Sooner or later, though, the words will stop. I'll run out of words. And Quinn picks that up at the very end when he starts writing the red notebook, asking himself the question, what happens when there are no more pages in the red notebook? Then he'll know more than he was able to put down in writing. You see, I would say, well, that's not what the narrator says or Auster says, but this to me is implied. What happens when there are no more pages in the red notebook? Is existence tied to writing? What actually happens in the novel is that Quinn disappears without a trace. No one can find his friends, try to find him. Paul Auster himself tries to find him, he's gone. And what does that mean? It means that his existence was tied to his writing, to the red notebook. Now there are no more pages in the red notebook, and then he's gone somewhere else. You know, it's remarkable. It's a great ending of the novel, because then of course Auster the narrator and author with him are also saying what happens when you addressing the reader. What happens when you finish reading the City of Glass? Right. And there are no more words to read, and no more words to write in the novel.
I'm going to jump back then.
Yeah, please.
Just that, I mean, instead of just performing the role of the Hegelundian advocate, like, I think it's worth considering. At least I think as a critique of Kierkegaard, it's a misplaced critique, because Kierkegaard is effectively not arguing a total detachment from finite existence, but a kind of a requalified reattachment. That's the difference between resignation and faith. And then the question sort of becomes, if you wanted to mobilize some kind of critique, and I think that then becomes quite reminiscent of Kierkegaard's critique of what he thinks of as Hegelianism. And maybe that's a wrong view of Hegelianism. I mean, Zizek, for instance, has tried to read Hegel in quite a different way, and I'm not getting into that, but that version of it, like, maybe there are different reasons to be a little more skeptical towards that finished framework of finite social, what is giving and taking of Brandonian reasons, right? Because maybe we aren't as individuals, maybe it's a little bit, as I said before, potentially alienating to just understand your own identity as a product of processes of social recognition or social reasoning. And maybe politically, sometimes what you need is not just a continuation of that giving and take, but something more like a rupture, an event which breaks in and totally destroys the coordinates and throws out new ones. And I think I have a hard time seeing how Hegeland's sort of vocabulary can deal with these, I mean, in my estimation, like real issues. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, please feel free to skip in with the questions. I'm just gonna prod the Gisle a little bit on a different translation.
I would like to ask him a question.
Yeah, please. Yeah, go for it.
Just, I mean, I think this is also, maybe this is like a cheap shot, but you know, I mean it very open-endedly, but you know, if we want politics, Kierkegaard inspired or not, that is a little bit less rational and more open to like this rupture, the eventful, like, is there any kind of, why should we believe that that kind of politics will be progressive politics as opposed to Trump sort of seizing that? I mean, this is like a standard. I was just curious when I wanted to ask you that question, and we had no question time.
Yeah, sure.
But do you have? I sometimes sort of struggle with what's the good answer to that worry. But I'm not even sure I'm addressing your talk. It's just
no. Well, the easiest answer is that, well, you have no guarantee, and that's what politics is all about. That you cannot rely on any version of the big other. You have to accept the wager, and you have to act, and you always act in a kind of empty. Not empty space exactly, but without these guarantees that could tell you what the outcome would be. Because if not, it wouldn't be a radical act, it wouldn't be a disruption. So that is what it might be an easy answer, but I think also it's the correct answer, because if you sort of make up a kind of solution before you have any situation in which it could actually be envisioned and agreed upon in a political, practical way, you would be cheating yourself, and you would be cheating your fellow strugglers as well. And that's why despite troubles that one might have with this concept of rupture and the event and the occurrence that you cannot sort of deduce from the world, from the situation in a theoretical way. You need this concept if you are to be able to think change in a radical way at all. You cannot just plan things in advance and call it an event and call it a rupture, because a rupture occurs. And that's also what distinguishes somehow the event from the act. They are not the same, of course, because one comes from kind of exterior, outside yourself, and then you attach yourself to it. An act might mature or suddenly be present in your own psyche, sort of, and then you act on it as something between a reflection and an impulse. But you have to think both of those in a kind of simultaneous way to be able to explain even the possibility of going beyond what is commonly accepted as possible. And if you don't do that, you don't have the act. You might even say that you don't have politics, properly speaking, in the radical sense. You look skeptical.
Just to be sure that I understand you, because I mean, I would at least be skeptical, like for very banal reasons, that a disruption which changes things is a good idea just because it disrupts, because many disruptions and changes would be bad.
Of course.
So what you're saying is, it seems like maybe it's simply on a different level, like you need this concept to make possible a special kind of change, but whether that change should then happen is sort of a different question, right?
Yeah, and it would have to be addressed and taken into consideration in every concrete situation, I would say. But if you don't, and of course, we all prefer to live peacefully. Well, that's not
my point.
No, but that's reasonably enough. But if you want to be able to think something that has not been implemented, something that has been even categorized as impossible to achieve, then you need a way of accounting for the change of what is actually accepted as possible versus the impossible. And that is a very common way of talking about things in politics as we know it from those in power. Well, that is simply not possible. You cannot think that way, because then you sort of buy into a lot of things that are accepted or not accepted as feasible within the society in which we live. So then, so some kind of explanation for why and in which way a true change can happen. You sort of need to cope with that theoretically to be able precisely to answer or start to answer the questions like that one. And perhaps one should also remind oneself that there are dangers involved every time you have a real event, a real eruption of the status quo, so that you can really face up to the dangers involved in those processes.
Is that, sorry, but is the notion of anxiety relevant to this kind of danger that you presuppose? I mean, you must presuppose there's a danger, but doesn't that danger entail that there is an element of anxiety in this change?
Yeah, there should be even. You need obstacles like that one, and you need to feel that you really are risking something, not to just buy into every fanatical project at any time. So you need, of course, well, you also need to scrutinize the concept of fanaticism, and that would actually be a way of caring for something that is not a person. That's Hegel's definition of fanaticism. It's enthusiasm for the abstract. So okay, sometimes we need enthusiasm for the abstract, but not always. You need a sort of enthusiasm for the concept of freedom or liberty. Yeah. Of course, you might argue against the French Revolution, but it was a progressive revolution after all. And without this way of sticking really to the idea, which is abstract in a sense, and idea is, well, out there in a sense, and you try to implement it in the real world. If you don't have this kind of proto-fanaticism or fanaticism in a good sense, then the change won't happen. And I don't believe there are many people in today's modern world that really deplore the French Revolution as a concept and idea, even though, of course, the terror was horrible.
But I think, at least abstractly, I think Hegel would agree with everything you just said. Because it's only abstract if you hold on to the concept and don't try to install it into the world. That's the, like, there can be an idea, you just have to act on it. The concrete is not, it's sort of incorporate the ideal level. That's not, that's how I would read it.
Could I ask you a question? It struck me when you were presenting your criticism of the conflation between resignation and faith in Hegel. It seemed to me that your argument was that Hegel doesn't really cope with the concept of faith. What he calls, what he believes is faith sometimes is only it has gotten stuck with the night of resignation. Would you say that that is parallel to the discussion of the difference between recollection and repetition in Gjentagelsen? Because then you would have a pretty interesting point, because then Hegel would stick with the pagan and not with the Christian. Because, well, this way of reflecting back, of resigning, sort of commemorating in a way what is past instead of acting on faith in the present is exactly what is at stake when Kierkegaard differentiates between Platonic pagan recollection and Christian repetition.
No, but I mean, these books are also written pretty much at the same time, and I think the weirdest of the quotes I had on my PowerPoint, he actually specifically says that one of the characteristics of the night of resignation, or the movement of infinite resignation, is to only remember the life you have lived. And I think I could have put that more precisely, because it's actually not the life you have lived literally and then you remember it. It's also the fact that you see that all the life I'm going to live but haven't lived yet, it's all gonna vanish. So I might as well start to remember in advance. Which is also like the aesthete in Enten Illa also despairs even before.
And that's what the melancholic lover in Gjentagelsen.
And that's it's a movement of anamnesis.
So we agree, totally.
Is this